without Ukraine, Russia would remain a powerful state, but with Ukraine, Russia could claim to be an empire again. The pictures of Russian tanks that have been circulated by the Western media do raise doubts of whether these were Russian tanks. It's over 3 months since Moscow began what it called a special military operation in Ukraine under the pretext of stopping Ukraine from joining NATO. But as the operations unfolded, several things became clear. One was it wasn't just about NATO, but it was Putin's desire to annex all of Ukraine. Because as one commentator said, that without Ukraine, Russia would remain a powerful state, but with Ukraine, Russia could claim to be an empire again. But then, what went wrong with Russia's military operation? Any analyst observing the unfolding of events over the last 3 months would have observed the following things which were consistently wrong with Russia's military operation. One, of course, to start with, Russia entered Ukraine with a sense of hubris or a sense of total self-confidence that they would really not have to fight their way into occupying the country, and they would, in fact, their troops would be welcomed by the people of Ukraine as liberators. Quite clearly, Mr. Putin had no intelligence feedback about the ground reality and was living in a state of self-delusion. Ukraine fought back, and how? But what is more important is that Ukraine was fighting for its survival, and you can't defeat a country or its people who are willing to die. Whereas for Russia and the Russian troops, there was no clarity of their military aims. There was no clarity of how the operations would unfold beyond just going into Ukraine, carrying the Russian flag and planting it in the center of Kyiv. Russian troops came pretty close to doing that, but then Ukraine bounced back. But not just on its own, it also bounced back with a lot of American and European military support and supplies. But what was very clear, that the Russian forces that were sent in were neither following military tactics nor had any idea about what their objective was. It was all very well for Russian propaganda to say, we are going to denazify Ukraine. But anybody with any sense of world information and global news would know that Ukraine was far from Hitler's Nazi land, and trying to denazify a country which was from time to time a part of the earlier Russian Empire was an objective which you couldn't achieve because the Nazi element didn't exist. But what existed in Ukraine was the great sense of self-belief, technological know-how, an understanding of Russian equipment, because many items of Russian equipment were similarly made available through the Ukraine industrial complex to many parts of the world. The T-series tanks are a case in point. The frontline tanks, and some of them are the best in the world. But Ukraine knew how they operated, how they worked, and how they could be withheld and destroyed. But the pictures of Russian tanks that have been circulated by the Western media do raise doubts of whether these were Russian tanks or the Ukraine manufactured T-series tanks, which look very similar. But an acute observer of tanks would tell you there is a difference between Russian equipment and Ukrainian equipment, and therefore some people might argue that for propaganda purposes these were Ukrainian tanks that were blown up and thrown on the sides of the road to show that Russian assault was failing. But failing it was for a variety of reasons. One, Russian troops in the front line were not all 100% trained and committed regular soldiers, but many frontline units had conscripts in them. And conscripts, as we know, don't like to fight, don't like to die, because they want to live to go and make a living on another day. Secondly, the Russian forces, which had been configured some years ago into what were known as battalion tactical groups, and what in other parlance military commanders would call combat groups, were not entirely linked up with their higher headquarters, like the divisions, corps, and even further up. And likewise, the various formations, one attacking Kyiv, another coming in from Ukraine's east, another coming in from the further southern parts of Ukraine, where the battles were taking place in Mariupol and various parts of connecting Crimea to southeast Ukraine, were all disconnected. They were not in sync with the overall national aims of Russia, and nor were they commanded by one supreme commander. That only came into being after 2 months, which was again a shocker of a news, that how could you go in for a large-scale military operations like this without a proper commander or a military commander responsible for the operations. The other aspect was that the Russians were not using classic military tactics. The tanks were moving on the roads, they were not moving away from the roads, and tanks are essentially designed for off-road military activity. They move using foliage and cover, and move in a tactical way by operating what the military calls in fire and move tactics, that you occupy a particular location, then the next lot moves to another location, then the next lot moves to another location. This wasn't happening. So what the Ukrainians did smartly, used hit and run tactics. Like guerrillas, go and hit the long Russian columns that were lined up, for example, outside Kyiv in the earlier months of the operations, and therefore cause panic and disarray, and also destroy their logistic and supply lines, which is essential for any long-term military operations. Likewise, the Ukrainians were also using the fantastic accuracy that is provided to them by US-made anti-tank weapon systems, like the Javelin anti-tank systems. Because what this does, these are rockets, they go close to a tank and just go about a meter above the tank and blow up on top of the tank. And what this does is, it is a top attack ammunition, but it hits the tanks in their most soft and vulnerable parts, that is right at the top of the tank, which are not heavily armed, and where the commanders and tank gunners sit. And therefore, it destroys that tank's leadership team, and likewise has an impact on the neighboring tanks also. Also, the Ukrainians were using a lot of top-end and top-attack robots and UAVs, and these would go right in large flocks above tank formations and play havoc with their state of fighting equipment. And finally, Russian attack helicopters that were coming in were hit with great accuracy by US-made Stinger missiles. These were used by the US successfully, as we know, in the Afghanistan campaigns, when they armed the Mujahideen to hit at Russian forces in the 70s and 80s. And now these modified and upgraded versions were being used against the Russians again. In a way, the Russian forces did all the things that you should not do in a military campaign, So, notwithstanding Russia's technological edge, notwithstanding Russia's huge firepower, troops were insufficiently provided for commanders on the ground. Classically, Russia's forces should have had a 3-to-1 advantage over the forces of Ukraine. But when the people of Ukraine all gathered together to defend their country, Ukraine had a 3-to-1 advantage over Russian forces. Now that was a bizarre situation where a military invasion was being carried out by forces who were insufficiently provided with the manpower, with the proper leadership, and with the proper counters to what became known to Russia were being provided by US and the European countries to Ukraine to defend itself. No doubt, America wants the war to go on forever, because the longer it goes on, the longer Mr. Putin is shown in bad light, and the longer the Russian military might is reduced to much lower impact quality than it had before the start of the Ukraine campaign. But when can we hope that Ukraine or Russia would reach a meeting point where the campaign could see a ceasefire? See, classically, conflicts don't end when at least one side has something to boast about. Pakistan sought a ceasefire in 1971 when India had virtually taken over Bangladesh, now what was East Pakistan. Pakistan's air force was destroyed, the military was surrounded, and their coastline was surrounded by the Indian Navy. So they sought a ceasefire, and the rest is history. In 1965, Pakistan attacked us, first in Kashmir Valley, then in Punjab. But when India retaliated with all its might, Ayub Khan quickly sought UN mediation and a ceasefire, because without that, he would have been looking as a complete loser to his own people. But in this case, if Ukraine seeks a ceasefire, Mr. Putin could claim victory. But if Mr. Putin seeks a ceasefire now, what is he going to sell to his people? That he has captured Ukraine? That he has denazified its people? That he has now prevented NATO's expansion to Russia's border? Notwithstanding the fact that this, like all conflicts do, has a ripple effect on other issues. Because now, with Russia's aggression, another country which is bordering Russia with a 1,300-kilometer border, and that is Finland, is now joining NATO. So NATO will be on Russia's borders again. Just like Musharraf went to challenge the sanctity of the line of control with his Kargil invasion, and he ended up sanctifying the line of control, because America said that we recognize line of control between India and Pakistan as the de facto boundary over Jammu and Kashmir. Back to Ukraine. What else could have been done by the Russians or the Ukrainian that could have changed the nature of this conflict? One is that the Russians did not use intelligence or intelligence inputs accurately. From the very beginning, their assessment of Ukraine's abilities, their assessment of where the conflict would go, and their assessment of how their troops were performing on the ground went horribly wrong. All this leads us to question that will Russia continue to be a military superpower? Well, historically, superpowers don't disappear. They are around, they will lose campaigns, but they'll still bounce back. America lost in the Vietnam War, but it still remained very influential in the geopolitics of the world. And America again claimed to be a winner in Afghanistan because it claimed the Taliban had sought peace. But that's debatable, because the Taliban that sought peace with America was the Taliban that was paid to seek peace with America. And when America left Afghanistan, it was anything but the departure of a victor from a battlefield. And therefore, America has got heavily involved in Europe because it has finally found its calling in geopolitics under Mr. Biden. It is now the champion of Europe and European interests. But the question is that if Russia accepts the end of conflict with the eastern parts of Ukraine that it has occupied, Donbass, Luhansk, the areas around Mariupol, and total control of the coastline of the Sea of Azov, is that what Russia is going to be willing to settle for? Or is this the start of a permanent Cold War between Russia and the West? And could it lead to another confrontation in another part of Europe very soon? And what are the lessons for China, which has now become Russia's embraced partner in geopolitics? Would China draw lessons from Russia's relatively failed operation? And I would say by most counts it has failed, for what it might want to do in Taiwan or Ladakh. But that is a matter of another discussion.